All right. We are live and good to get going. I'm really excited for this conversation. I feel like every time I check in with Disruption Joe, he's always got something else cooking and I learn something new. I think I'm really interested to dive deep into elements of the whole DAO governance and aspects more so around community strategy related to DAOs. This is someone who loves mechanism design. I think I've been very lucky to have been part of a lot of different workshops that Disruption Joe has done with the Miro boards and whatnot, and participating with other people to come up with different ideas, whether we're even just doing things actually in real life in Costa Rica with sticky notes on a wall, or whether or not we're, on a group call with a bunch of other people from a DAO. It's been really great to have seen, Joe all around the world at different conferences. We bump into each other. I don't know how many countries we've hung out together in. So without further ado, hop up on stage here. Joe, I'll pull you up. And yeah, it's good to see you, man.
Hey, good to see you as well. It's a fun intro. Yeah, there have been at least more than a handful of countries that we've got to do
Totally.
this.
Yeah, I feel like just the element of highly intellectual conversations and groups that we've been in that makes the conversation really fascinating as well. So that's always been a really great part about it. But it'd be good to get a little bit of like your own personal introduction. I know I rambled on a few thoughts from my perspective, but would love to hear your own kind of personal intro to anyone who might not know about you.
Yeah, sure. So I've been in crypto space for almost 10 years now, full time, and most notably has been was on the consensus team for Gitcoin, and then rolled out Gitcoin the company, and then was the first person to go into the DAO and start a work stream there. So that was one of the earlier DAOs. And then after fully vesting and finishing my time with Gitcoin, we closed down the fraud detection work stream, where I was like leading our civil defense and like grant review efforts, trying to make them a little more fair for the community. Then went to working primarily with Arbitrum and starting their first grants programs and bringing a more pluralist model to how they were starting. And after, during the engagement with Arbitrum, my Plurality Labs was merged with Thrive Protocol, so I worked with them for a year, and then decided that I wanted to stay more in the governance and mechanism design range than like product refinement. And Thrive Protocol is actually one of the few like crypto companies that's not DeFi that actually has revenue. They're one of the only companies in crypto that's actually made more money than they've raised. So they were doing well, and it was time for product refinement for them as a company. So I'm still a big supporter, but I really wanted to be in the middle of governance and solving these DAO and community problems. And so I spent a little time working on a project called Mother last year, which was probably the last time we saw each other around ETH Denver, which didn't have the right timing to move forward. And then I joined with Hack Humanity just recently. So the last few months I've been working on Near Protocol's launch of House of Stake, which actually Near Protocol launched House of Stake yesterday. And so people can lock up their Near to get VNear, a vote escrow Near governance token, and start making decisions, now.
Wow, that's super cool. That'd be good we can jam and talk a little about that at some point. I think that's great to kind of have some very recent element of conversation. And I think Near is really fascinating as well. But yeah, I think like just your experience that you mentioned multiple companies there, seeing things grow from the beginning, kind of figuring out problem solving, different elements of it, I think that there's a lot of probably lessons that you've learned throughout different, growth kind of concepts in a certain sense when it comes to governance and seeing organizations grow, right? So I think it'd be really fun to dive into some of those projects and learn a little bit more about some of them. I got a few kind of questions lined up, but one of the first questions we ask people near the beginning when we interview them, and I'm curious to know how you'll think through this one, is how would you define the word community?
Well, this is fun because when I started in the crypto space, I wanted to do a startup, and this is back like 2017 that basically was a DAO. So I started with a meetup that was a Bitcoin, Ethereum, and crypto meetup. And what I found was that people would start asking, "What is this?" And sometimes somebody would answer well, sometimes they wouldn't. And so I started doing an intro talk every time to make sure there wasn't bad information going. I started watching a lot of like Antonopoulos talks to make sure I wasn't spouting bad things. And that grew. And my interest turned into the DAO space and just the decentralized organizing. And that meetup grew to almost 4,000 members in about a year and a half. And we were doing 3 meetups a week. I had multiple other organizers, and what we did was we created an umbrella over like a bunch of other, not over, but with a bunch of other community organizations and meetups and so forth, where we were doing events around the city, and they were kind of autonomously pushing things, and we were supporting them as kind of a marketing layer to the whole thing. And that gave me a lot of insight to both like DAOs and community. And you can actually find on like YouTube, there was a group called like Omni Sparks back then that asked me this question, probably 2017, about, and they were building a community platform for, basically crypto, like ICOs back then. It's like, how do you actually get your community to like talk and be effective and so forth? And my definition of community is that you have stake in like a shared purpose. And so that can be stake that is like capital, which is we think of with the tokens, but that can also be other forms of capital. There's these like 8 forms of capital, right? There could be, social capital, like reputation. There could be, labor time put into it. There could be expertise. There's a lot of different ways that somebody can put stake into the community. But I would say the thing that people usually miss to me when they say community, especially in this industry, is the fact that community is born around a culture of like some shared values or purpose. And so culture by definition is exclusive. It's like, this is what we do that other people don't. Mm-hmm. Right. And so when these groups try to be inclusive, they think of it as like 100% openness to anybody with no filtering mechanism to make sure that they're aligned or have stake in the same values and purpose. So I think there's a lot of different ways you can, judge that stake, whether they have the stake. It doesn't have to just be the token. But it is people that have some stake in this shared purpose first. So your openness and inclusivity in a community is not what makes it a community. It's, if you want to be inclusive, you make sure that there's pathways for people that have different advantages and disadvantages to being able to connect. Like, you want to make it inclusive, include other languages, right? And include access pathways for people who aren't developers, things like that. But first and foremost, before this, creating those pathways is identifying what is your community, right? So this is something that becomes legitimate as your community figures out ways to define what its purpose is and what its values are, which create the boundary or the membrane, right, of like what is community and what isn't.
Yeah. No, very, very well-rounded answer on different components. And I think it's
10 years ago, it was a way worse answer, by the way.
You've learned a lot the last few years, right? Yeah, totally. I think that's like our name in itself, co-unity, stems from breaking apart kind of community into common unity, co-unity. And common unity is like a group of people in the same unity, a group of people in the same direction, that shared kind of belonging and whatnot. And later on, actually, I'm going to share something which I think you'll like. So in each episode, typically at some point, I'll pop my screen. I'll actually share my screen. I usually share some sort of community related tool and talk a bit about it. And then I'll share some sort of community related framework. And I basically run through like a brief description of the tool, and I run through a brief description of the framework. And then I'd love to hear what your thoughts are and what kind of bubbles to the top of your head on that. So we'll get to that after we get through some of these questions and whatnot. One of the places to start, I think, you mentioned this in your introduction. I'm sure some people listening may have been like, what did he say? Like, what's that? When it comes to plurality, and this element of plurality labs. And tell me more about where that word stems from, what it means to you, what's the definition of it, and how does it play into, your work and DAO governance in this aspect. I'd love to get an explanation there.
Yeah, I think to me, plurality is an extension of when we think about like what the goal of like democracy is, right? If you think about like most people think about the juxtaposition of democracy and a monarchy, right? And then they get a little bit more advanced, and they get to like 102 in like university, and they start thinking about plutocracies and oligopolies and democratic socialism and all these different mechanisms for like building towards political ends. And eventually all of them end up being some form of like basically a constitutional republic if they're not a monarchy or a straight democracy, right? And all this means is that we've agreed that there's this legitimate set of rules that says in this instance we work with centralized authority, in this one we work with more direct or electoral processes and so forth. When I think of pluralism, I think it's an extension on that. It says like there's ways of making decisions that are best for getting the outcomes that you're looking to do. So, for example, the way you would hire a service provider might be different than the way that you would fund public goods or infrastructure, right? The way that you hire a service provider may be different than the mechanisms you would use to hire somebody who works at City Hall, right, as an employee. The way you hire a service provider would be different than the way you choose to make early investments into businesses. Like if you're building a city, gas stations and grocery stores to make sure that, people can move into the neighborhoods, and you're giving a subsidy to these businesses. And sure, it's unfair, but you need those in the neighborhood, right? And so when we think about like pluralism, it's really a call to say that most of these governance mechanisms give us one way to make decisions. And because we don't have multiple ways to make decisions, what we usually do is say, let's put all authority in one person, a president, and then have checks and balances through bodies that make sure that they're bounded. And it takes away all opportunity for things that are best done with direct discovery and direct democracy to not have access to the system, and the things that shouldn't be done by centralized means to continue to have power elements of corruption and collusion that like seep in that are unnecessary. So pluralism says like let's find ways that prioritize more purpose-fit ways of governing ourselves based on the outcomes we want to receive.
Okay, so let's throw like a hypothetical out here then. Let's say an organization realizes they've got complex decisions, as you mentioned, different categories of things. Maybe they want to hire a service provider. Maybe they want to donate to charity, like different types of things like you talked to there. What would be like a very baseline, I think you mentioned these in the past, like pluralistic framework for an organization to think through how they might actually start to, come up with a system for this? Because I know you love like the system design side things. Like where would you start with like a community or project with something like this?
Yeah, I think this is the main thing that I'm trying to work on with Hack Humanity in like building out like a governance transition program, something that takes you from a community foundation led to community led. Mm-hmm. And this is really what I've been trying to work on since even before Gitcoin, is figuring out how to do this. And the reason is there's kind of a few modes that like this group can take, right? They can be founder led, right? I'm always going to have the control because I'm the founder, and I may give you rooms and delegate authority and different things, but I can always take that away, right? And reshuffle the cards. They can be autocratic led through election, right? So this is appoint a president, or like Ave DAO is like an example of something that works pretty well because they've democratically elected, like, this is the group that's going to run things, and then they're going to put other things in place. Now that risks, some level of centralization when you need like censorship resistance at some point. But for some purposes, it works well. For Aave, it works well for what they're trying to do. Then you want to be decentralized, and you can do it in two ways. There's basically drop here's how we vote on proposals, and good luck to everybody. Arbitrum launched like this. It's pretty interesting. Gitcoin pretty much launched like that. A lot of the earlier DAOs did. And then there's these ideas around progressive decentralization, which is, okay, we're not just going to go into this piece of land with, all these people who are interested and say, here's how you put proposals through City Hall. We're going to hire some people at City Hall. We're going to build the roads and create zoning rules and so forth, such that, we know that this is more likely to succeed. Right? And when I think about practically implementing some pluralism, I think that we've learned that there's this thing that happens over and over. I call it the chaos to centralization trap, which is when you launch and just say anybody can do anything. There's some people putting proposals about we should hire people at City Hall. There's some people saying we should put one road here. And there's some people saying we should build a system for the roads that numbers them like this. And other people are saying you should give my gas station money. It doesn't even have a road yet, but I want you to give me a gas station, even though there's nobody who lives in this neighborhood yet. Right? You're getting a lot of different proposals. So I think there's some amounts of structure that would say things like, okay, we're going to delegate some budget and authority to a group over here that is going to handle request for subsidies from gas stations and grocery stores. We're going to delegate authority to this group to make sure that all infrastructure is not competing, that we're not making plans to build the subways where the electric lines are, right? Things like this. And so as you think through each of these potential risks, you can think through, well, what are the different authorities that are needed, where if a bunch of individual proposals come up, they may holistically conflict and not make as good of an outcome. What level of structure is needed that allows for autonomous and independent proposing of ideas to end up being channeled into productivity rather than disjointed waste, right? So pluralism is one avenue towards using like collective intelligence to do that.
Mm. And so with that, then, like, when you mention those last few sentences, AI coming into the picture, right? And to be able to see lots of data, moving pieces, and, how does that factor into pluralism, into like this kind of adaptive governance, vision in a certain sense? Curious, what are your thoughts there?
I've been having a lot of conversations with the Near ecosystem lately, and one of their primary goals is to use AI in governance. And so they put forward a AI product roadmap of some of the early things that they think are, good things that they can, test in products to build for the governance structure. I have the problems that we've run into in Hack Humanity in thinking about how we co-create and do things in a better way. We like to use this idea of co-creation cycles around how things are built. So, for example, in Near, there's the idea that we put an interim constitution in place so things could get started, that there's, solves a chicken and egg problem with an expiry date that basically all power stops if this doesn't get replaced by this date. And now we're running co-creation cycles where there's open feedback period and things that are generally known as best practices for democratic systems. Like if you're going to change a law, a rule, there should be a reasonable amount of time for feedback. You should make attempts to get representative feedback. But the problem that we see here is like, it's like, I think of these 3 levels of stakeholders. If it was SpaceX, it would be like Elon Musk and like BlackRock are like the biggest investors, right? And like the most important. And then there's all the employees and people who head different departments and like the engineers who have their heads down. And they're real stakeholders, right? And then there's all these fans and people who buy, stuff or like whatever merch or, like are standing there watching the spaceships go up and whatnot. And when you do an open community call, those are the people who show up mostly. Elon Musk isn't showing up for a community call about what the code of conduct should say, right? However, if you were to really fuck it up, you might actually have something to say. So, but you also want to think about those viewpoints. So I think this is a really interesting place where you can actually use AI, like basically synthetic representations of like what a representative for a key stakeholder group that normally wouldn't show up might say. So, in many DAOs, you have like validators, you have like VC type investors versus like independent or retail investors. You have the core protocol developers, you have application developers that are building on top of the protocol. Those are unique interests from the core protocol developers. And so finding out what your key stakeholder groups and creating some key stakeholder group like AI representatives that can then look at the feedback generated by the fans and say, well, my point of view actually feels that this is not a good. So when you make decisions to like modify or adapt or ignore feedback or different rules, you can at least show that you've taken the input of the perspective, even if you weren't able to get Elon Musk in the room, right?
Yeah. No, because I think like organizations, especially in Web3, have evolved to be more complex, especially bringing in the DAO component. Like from a community side, we're segmenting a lot of communities we work with quite a bit so that projects can understand and nurture, who's just a farmer, who's actually like an interested retail buyer, who's a validator, or like running a node or something. These people all have like very different goals and objectives and plans and things that they care about, right? And I think then, of course, from like the founder project of like the protocol or whatever, to have representation on what their vision and goals and thoughts are and perspectives and whatnot. I think that's really fascinating around getting the synthetic like conversation even so that people can even just understand it. Like even an old version of this, I think Notebook LM did this thing where, and it kind of was a big hit across, AI for a little while. This was a while ago though, in AI time. But we could do like a podcast where you could do like a fireside with different people and you could do this like little AI podcast and have different like roles and people having conversation and then just like put them into their own fireside. Like there's an element of that would be fascinating for DAOs to even entertain in their own way around like a more of an organized forum perspective,
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess the last thing I think about with AI stuff is that many of the DAOs, and this connects it to pluralism, many of the DAOs they have one decision-making modality, which is like a vote, right? But without voting for some budget and authority to be given to what you might think of as like districts or local like efforts or in your city, like these aren't exactly aligned to stakeholder groups or more aligned to like outcomes that DAO wants to manifest, right? But it's kind of like, okay, once we decide we want to manifest an outcome, then it's probably more likely that an expert guiding like what the process is and the work back plans and so forth, what needs to be hired to put together a holistic plan needs to be like involved. So you need to delegate some level of authority there. Now, let's say one thing you're grading this work stream, maybe you call it, on is are they going to hit the KPI or outcome goals that they're focused on hitting? Another thing you might look at is, well, are they also making decisions at that level that some of the decisions would benefit from larger groups of input? So not all fully authoritarian of like once that power is delegated. So like, let's say you delegate 200K and you say this person is leading that workshop. Well, they could say, okay, I want to find what is the best possible plan for us to hit this goal that we've been assigned to, and then put it for open proposal to the community for people to suggest different things, and maybe 10K prize to the plan that sounds the best. But then you get participation from people who want to make plans and are great at that, but don't have the time to like actually manage and do the whole work, right? Because they have a job and they're doing it already, right? Now you got a work bed plan. Okay, we need to hire these service providers. This needs marketing on top of it, all that, right? And then you go and find somebody to hire who can like manage that and go hire out a bunch of different service providers, hopefully through more open RFPs and things that are more access and give the community more different ways that they can get involved and get paid. The thing that people miss when they think about these work streams, though, is like, we want to test all these AI governance things, and you don't want to run that at the level of governance that is a critical failure point for the entire organization. So a work stream in like having this lower governance level actually becomes like a test environment, kind of like we do with products, where then you can merge the successful things into the main governance once they've been tested outside of the critical path.
Yeah. So. Yeah, no, that's interesting. I think like, touching on like the voting element there and thinking through, on the voting side for community, it's fascinating to see like in, the Web3 industry, these elements of, do you give people who've got stake, the vote and they've got like capital, or how do you give like the people who are knowledgeable and maybe don't have the capital, like these elements of different mechanisms. And I know there's like, conviction voting or quadratic, and people have always played around with, what is the right model to give this decision-making frameworks to community, and like talking about these elements of how, AI can potentially fork and help in different ways, but also to do it to your point, like in a work stream or in a segmented area where that wouldn't ever potentially affect like larger direction or a certain sense of an organization. But like around some of the details or thoughts on, decision-making frameworks themselves, like what do you think right now is something projects should be thinking more about in their DAOs around this? Like, how can they think more about these problems around decision-making? What's your latest on that?
I think a more structured approach to proposals in general is a good thing, because like I said, if it was the start of the city and some people are putting in a proposal to say, I want a street here and it should be 4 lanes and, it should have all these things, versus somebody putting a proposal to say, we should have streets that run primarily north and south, and the north and south ones will be, spread by this much and they will be this wide, and the east and west ones will be, thinner, but more of them. And, they're putting together a structural plan. These two things aren't compatible. You got to do one or the other, right? So if the one happens, it holistically blocks the other from being a reality. Right? And so when you have this free-for-all for proposals, I don't think that's smart or useful. The structure that I think needs to be in place to set initial conditions that will get to productivity and not fall into the centralization trap is you want to be able to first ask, like, is this an outcome that we want? Right? So that could be, what are the outcomes we want? And then let's vote on which ones are the highest priority. right? Or what we'll consider inbounds for funding or not, right? Or what we'll consider things that we're measuring, steward performance or workstream performance on or not. You
And who
can
should get
align
that?
it different ways, right?
And who should get that like voting power? Like from your perspective, with a lot of, I mean, I guess it probably is different depending on the organization and whatnot. But do you think people who are putting tokens at stake should have that voting power, or do you think more of like the elected, knowledgeable folks should have that voting power? Like, how do you then think about the voting power side of things for those initial decisions?
I think we need more modularized processes. So, like, a process might start with saying, okay, we're going to have a vote of should we, set like clear outcome goals that we're going to measure whether we're successful or not. The outcome goals will define what we're working on, right? So we know it's a North Star, but there's a million things that could go there. These are the things that we're going to measure to see if we're actually making progress towards our North Star. We're going to agree these are them, right? And then you have a process to say, and that process in itself has a few stages, right? Like you have to actually have somebody draft an idea. What are these potential things? That's what I think these co-creation cycles that we're working with near will do is it's a process the community can get used to of, okay, here's an idea, somebody drafts it, and then there's a feedback period, there's the AI key stakeholder alignment, and then you redraft it and put a feedback report of what feedback came from humans, what was the answer of these different synthetic stakeholders, and now here's a new draft. And is this ready to vote on? So, you can go from do we want, like, what outcomes do we want to define and measure, to then saying, okay, well, if we wanted this, what is the best possible plan to do this? So I think that if we want to do this, and how much budget do we want to put towards it overall holistically is much more of a token holder thing, skin in the game in that way.
Mm-hmm.
And then the election of the experts, and it can be that there's combined hiring elective processes or committees. There's a bunch of different ways you could do it. But then you get into how are we going to do it? I think that's where the expertise needs to be there then, and you delegate some authority to somebody to own doing that. Now, if that person just thinks they're the smartest person in the world and doesn't open up for feedback in how they create the plan that's going to get there, that's probably a big warning sign, right? So delegating authority doesn't mean that you think that person's the smartest in the world or the one that can just draft a plan and create the perfect plan for something very complex themselves. Delegating authority means you trust that person has the domain knowledge and experience and expertise to be humble enough to allow for community participation because they know they need it to being successful.
No, that's great. That makes a lot of sense though around what you said there, with just this aspect of those who have real skin in the game and stake. Have much more of a say around, what is the budget of, to your point, asking the question, what is the outcome we want? Well, can we even, afford this outcome, or what kind of amount of allocation of budget, or, what do we want to have happen for the organization? Like, what is it? And then around the actual details of how we get there, let's have, the engineers build that road, and the people who are actually understanding of the space or, domain expertise related to this, have a more of a way on that how. I think that makes like a lot of sense.
Do you know Justine from she was head of governance for Optimism? She has a really great way of thinking of this. So you can find the post pretty easy, but she in Optimism posted this idea of there being three things that you make decisions for. You make judgments on very subjective, what do we want to do? And this is kind of what is our purpose? What's our North Star? What should we focus on right now? How much should we put towards it in overall and aggregate? And then you get into predictions, like we think this person is going to be the best at leading it. We think this plan will be the best plan to potentially manifest that outcome, right? we think that this like service provider, whatever might be the best to do this work. And then you get to like more the accountability of like, well, measurement, right? So it's like
Feedback loop.
judgments are the broadest group of people. And then predictions are generally smaller groups of people that are domain experts and so forth. So like more work stream level. And then measurements should be done in a more technology driven way than something that introduces bias. It's not a judgment. And then you use the output of that to make new judgments about what you should do.
That's
and
cool.
The cycle's really good. A good way to think of it.
That's really cool. I really like that flow. It really lands for me as well, with the way that we even approach a lot of what we do with community. We lean heavily on community analytics. We use 4 or 5 different tools. We do our own AI scraping, and we have this little, we call it our GTC flywheel, our go-to community strategy flywheel, which is elements of looking into the community and the conversations and the participation, engagement, and all these different elements of what is, to your point, the non-opinionated, transparent, just like data of the community. What can insights, tell us a bit about that? What type of topics are talked a lot about? What do they seem to have an affinity for, right? And then we come up with a hypothesis, which is like, the prediction side thing in a certain sense, or like, we think this type of gamified community experience design would work well for this project. And we drop it in there, right? And then it's a bit of a loop where that then builds some trust, builds some loyalty, and then the numbers come back from the analytics reporting again after the event, and we see, okay, well, what's changed? Like, oh wow, we got this much growth, we got this much engagement, we got this much whatever. We could tweak it a little bit and let's refine and do it again. And that's like this element of this flywheel, right? Of constantly looking at analytics and that measurement side, that feedback side, to loop back to our judgment, making our decisions, and then to the prediction / I say hypothesis, the community scientific approach of let's just make a hypothesis based off of this information, and using that kind of judgment layer and then running it back. And I think like the tighter you dial in that loop and the more information that you collect around that loop just starts to make it more efficient and starts to make your results better, right? I think it plays into a lot of this with a variety of different things for organizations, right?
Yeah, I think absolutely. And that measurement piece, you probably have to hire somebody like a special service provider like you guys do for the community pieces, like for, different types of like, technical detection for different things. Let's say you're looking for a parameter change of like economic this, there's all kinds of service providers like a Gauntlet and so forth that do those types of things. But those service providers shouldn't be in there fighting for attention of all the delegates to get elected to hire their services, right? It should be something that's budgeted into like a work stream that is focused on getting unbiased information, hiring high quality service providers that are experts, know how to go and measure whatever the thing is, and then, give back that information such that the cycle can continue.
Totally. Yeah. Like different tools. Like we do a lot of work optimizing Cookie 3 from their data analytics side to see the on-chain behavior and connect it into the website traffic. So we have this really good picture of the top of the funnel of a community on who they are from a website visitor to their wallet behavior, to then knowing what kind of community experience design would build more loyalty and build more retention, which is oftentimes like the metric that we're focusing on the most with our clients and whatnot. There's a lot of buzz around the attention economy and like Kaido yaps and like snaps and like extrinsic rewards around attention. Lots of marketing agencies in the space now. So we've like kind of focused in on only thinking a bit about loyalty and the retention engine, and how do we find that intrinsic kind of connective tissue for community members to a project. And I think like this is an interesting component for us to dial in more on that, right?
I think that's awesome, because the retention is like your key thing of like even if you go to like SaaS data driven growth, like In DAOs, we get like the term growth gets quite bastardized from like what it is in more traditional like SaaS stuff. But in traditional SaaS, you'd usually think of growth as this function connecting marketing and the product to say,
Mhm.
what are the levers that we have that we can pull to increase our conversions at each stage? And then what are our hypothesis on which one of these levers would, or what experiment would pull which lever to create the biggest potential impact, right? And return growth. So it's a very data-driven, cyclical process. And you always think of it, or you should think of it in terms of engaged, like habit forming, like engagement, right? Like that the first place you go, like how often does this person use this? You know, what channel are they on when they think about like this need and so forth. So yeah, I think that's a really important way to do it.
Yeah, I think like on the SaaS side too, I read a book a little while ago. I've been recommending it to a few people. It's called Software as a Science. That's by Dan Hunt. And there's a lot of really great stuff in that book to help you think about scaling a SaaS product, and even just like unique, clever little tricks, and especially even leveraging more into AI and how you can personalize, SaaS more in different ways for people. Like some platforms are doing this thing where they mentioned if you signed up and paid for the enterprise version, which you have to put in like your company email, as soon as you landed on the platform, they were going to your website and automatically pulling a color
Right.
palette from your website, pulling like your logo and like personalizing your whole space that you didn't even have to input at all because they just scraped it from like your domain on your company email. Like clever little things that I think AI is helping a lot with. But I think we can learn a lot. Also, I learned a lot from agency stuff as well, service providing, just through reading this like software as a science book from a product perspective. I think there's lots of little lessons back and forth that you can learn from like service to product and whatnot, especially from a growth perspective, right?
Yeah, and breaking things down like to some level of like what actually converts or gets the response you want is a good practice. Like usually, like I mean, from a marketing community angle, you'd see like people say, "Oh, we should do this," and the conversation starts there,
Mm-hmm.
rather than we should do this. Well, why? Because I think it would increase this happening. Okay, that's one type of conversion. Is that total conversion, or is that conversion of one, you know, touch point? And then before we go ahead and say that, let's think what's the potential maximum return we could get from any experiment at each touch point, and then how would that translate into the final total conversion, right? And if you go about it like that, you're going to realize like 90% of the time that first idea is not where you should be focused on working. You're basically playing poker at the wrong table. You're fishing
Mm.
in the wrong part of the lake, right?
Yeah.
So no matter what you do, most of our ideas are, well, this is what you got to do to change the lure, or your betting strategy is wrong. But if you're at the wrong table or fishing in the wrong part of the lake, that's really not that important.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of that in the space too right now when it comes to, you mentioned this at the very beginning of the episode around like revenue with lots of projects and, really thinking like I don't see a lot of projects in the Web3 space thinking very critically on a business model perspective of what's my cost per acquisition, what's my lifetime value, elements like this. Those conversations don't seem to be as frequent in Web3 as they are in Web2 from a business model perspective. Because at the end of the day, too, a lot of these, DeFi protocols, projects, and whatnot, um, there's an important element to them having like a sustainable business model that then fuels that component of community participation until all these other things, gives them budget, gives them runway, like lets them survive, lets them breathe. It's oxygen in a certain sense. But yeah, I think that's, a lot to kind of learn there. But I'd be kind of curious, kind of one of my like only one or two more questions here. And around Near's House of Steak, I'm really curious to learn from you a bit. What were some of like in the conversations with Near around that? what were some of the things that you thought a bit about? What can we learn from? What can we improve? And tell me a little bit about the fruition of Near's House of Steak, if you're, filled in or willing to share some of that.
I'm willing to share, what I know, as part of the Hack Humanity team, where they were already working on Near and had done some gov hacks for Arbitrum previously, and plus had been doing hackathons for like corporate clients for years before that. Moving into this governance transition program as like the service is it brings a lot of like new thinking. Near is looking to launch the House of Stake so that there's some decision making that isn't only the validators whose viewpoints can be expressed. Most blockchain systems have this threshold based governance. Once X number of validators or miners run a software update, then that becomes the law, and anybody who didn't choose to run it is now seceded from the union, right? And that's how their governance works. And so only that one stakeholder group has power, which basically lets power express through forking. But it doesn't create lasting legitimacy against that group. It actually encourages separation if there's certain levels of dissonance. Now, you might say that that's good, and I think it is good that that exists, but for the long-lasting, network, you probably want some ways to make decisions that are seen as legitimate that include more stakeholders and don't encourage just forking as your only option if you don't agree with the validator group, right? So Near wants to figure this out and get this into House of Stake. They had tried doing a novel like one person, one vote system a few years back, and they ran into some issues with the structures, the governance structures that were there, that left the community a little bit unsure of how or if they wanted to, because with that experiment, they called it NDC, not working as well as some had hoped. The Near Foundation ended up kind of taking over, stewarding the network, and without any valid decision-making mechanism, they have to. And so It's been working to launch this House of Stake. And from everything I've been a part of, it seems like there's a lot of desire to do it in a way that will progressively decentralize and put the right structures in place. But there's still a lot of, like any community that's open for anybody's feedback, there's a wide range of disagreement and opinions on how much structure is enough. We know that it's not none, just start voting, but how much is enough? That's a very broad, open question. We've seen a lot of DAOs do nothing, and we know that doesn't work, but we don't know how much is too much. And so I think being more pragmatic and adaptive in it is the biggest thing. I think the second biggest thing is that, being honest with the community that there's going to be stages. So the governance transition program, as we announced, it's on their forum. We put it into separate phases. So there's this assembly phase where the authority comes from the foundation or whoever the people instigating the setup of this thing are, right? And in that phase, they're trying to create some bodies that start to test the decision-making mechanisms, but they're really doing the city planning still. And then there's an alignment phase where you replace these interim charties and committees with ones that are more community-driven processes to select or elect them. Right, so you then start to update each process by running co-creation processes for every one of these different bodies. Like if there's a screening committee or a security council, or there's endorsed delegates rather than just delegates, it's like, oh, they're expected to uphold a certain participation rate. Then you can get a stamp and be shown first. Any of these design decisions can go through a co-creation cycle of feedback from the community and AI delegate reps to then ratify a replacement that is now seen as legitimate. And then you can use that new charter or policy to then replace the interim group that has been put by, sort of by decree, right? but you're still there with some access to, safeguards and controls. And then you think, okay, what's the next safeguard or control we need to remove, right? And then does that still work? What's the next safeguard or control that needs to be, or boundary that needs to be added to policy or so forth? And bit by bit, pragmatically do that. I think that pragmatism and not feeling like we have to be 100% all communities included in everything all the time right from the start is necessary. We know it doesn't work to just drop it and everybody's included everything from the start, but we still have to figure out what is the balance, like what's the goal for that.
Interesting. Yeah, it's very strategic shaping in a certain sense, rather than just like racing and kind of reactivity. It's a little bit more shaping on proactivity in a certain sense for in relation to some of the decisions and whatnot. That's really I'm definitely looking forward to taking a peek through at House of Steak and checking out a bit more. One of the things I was just curious to ask you about in general for community, because I've thought about this with some of the projects we work with. Our overall ethos, like, I mentioned this GTC concept, go to community strategy. How does that compare to GTM? And the analogy we like to use a lot is it's more of this value creation model instead of a value capture model, right? Like GTM and marketing initiatives can often be like fishing, and it's needed to go out and find that attention, and you got to like go out and fish for it and, do your KOL, do your PR and kind of get the eyeballs on you, right? Whereas the value creation model, instead of like fishing, it's like forming a bit of a watering hole, right? Where when you get people there, they have such a great experience there that they go and tell other people about it, that, hey, come to this watering hole. It's a great place to be. And as a result, too, to this watering hole there, I like to extend it where there's almost little campfires that pop up like around it and structures to that like watering hole. And one of these elements might be, a group of people who want to have a little campfire, who want to, own what the shape of this watering hole looks like. Like, hey, we want to carve out a little lagoon here or whatever, and this like kind of leans into those are the community segment of, governance and wanting to participate from a DAO perspective with that project. My question is, with people who kind of get attracted into that, how do you typically find those types of people within a community? Is there anything that helps unveil in an early stage element where there's not much of like maybe the DAO and the foundation or some of that elements doesn't fully exist yet? How do you maybe test and find the people who seem like they're the ones who will be interested and passionate to help lead the charge on decentralized governance and shaping? Is there anything that you've seen in the past from growth in different projects and things that, stood out to you as in, oh, this is a really great process or a really great thing that was done here that resulted in a lot more voters, a lot more people participating in governance? I'm wondering if anything kind of rings a bell from your thoughts or anything, insights.
I definitely see, and the experiment with Pariah Labs at Arbitrum, we did 2 seasons. I connected with Thrive, and then we had other interests in how we design pluralism because they want to use the software as well. So there's a little bit more into that. But overall, we were able to give out like 400 and some grants, $6 million over like a year and a half, 22 different programs that had unique governance of each one. Right. And we were able to measure the results from each one and bring back data for them. Because that's too much information for like any one person to like evaluate every single one of those, some of the delegates would think this is wasting money because I can't personally keep track of it. But it's actually, with strong systems in place, it actually disperses through the pluralistic mechanism those things that check and make sure. And then we were building even better accountability mechanisms holistically around it. So I think the point is that if it works well, no one person's going to be able to handle the complexity of it and just manage it all, right? So it might look a little bit wild at first. So you got to like dig into what are the mechanisms that gave them the authority? Do we know what success looked like for them? One of the big mistakes we made was not having each program itself defined to a clear, specific outcome goal that was already mandated by the DAO. We had them set outcomes that they said they would do, but a lot of times they end up being self-referential. And when the DAO voted on the programs, they weren't voting, we think that's the best program to get this outcome that we already said. They just thought, holistically, that program idea looks really cool. So it kind of dispersed. But I think what we learned in terms of getting more people involved was each one of those small programs initiated a different group of people to participate. And so the number of meaningful ways to participate in Arbitrum was huge. And even today, like you get things where like, there's a post put out not too long ago about like, hey, here's like this, how like this step program that got $450 million to come to Arbitrum and RWAs and make them the leader. It was like, okay, well, we did this step program, which then made a plan and brought in the first ones. And then we followed up with step 2 and so forth. Well, before that was the grant program we were running that actually said, okay, we're going to fund this person to design a step program. And so with somebody getting paid to design, to first figure out what treasury avenues had the most potential and then design a plan that was intelligent, and they got paid for 3 months of doing that work. That's really where it started, right? Somebody outside of the full DAO would have never made that decision. But having this smaller group, having a more delegated authority to go and like spend some money to do that, we called them fire starter grants to get fire started in the DAO. They were able to pay, and that's what really got it to happen, right? So it might have seemed like there was a lot of chaos, but there was also a lot more that happened. So they spent $200 million in liquidity grants that in counterfactual synthesis like data shows almost a zero effect on their overall outcome. It spent $6 million on these grants and you get $450 million leading step thing, like by expanding. And the fun thing about it was me running the whole program that had all 22, under with it. Half of the time people got grants, like the Bahama conference that Stephen ran. They got a grant from Arbitrum. I didn't even know that they had it. Van out in Costa Rica, she got a grant and was having, local Costa Ricans using Arbitrum in Costa Rica. I didn't know she had gotten a grant. How is any one person going to look and see all the things that happen out of that? I think that's a success sign, is that people that are doing good work are getting grants and bringing actual use to real people, and you don't even know about it. Like,
it was well dispersed. I was actually reviewing some grants at one point as a part of like some of that project, I remember, and like the diversity was wild. And I think it's almost like an entrepreneurial venture model in a certain sense, where you kind of seed these different things from a small perspective, and then one of them almost returns the whole fund, from like a inner growth side of things. I think it was fantastic. Cool. I'm going to jump to, for the last like 10 minutes here as we wrap up, sharing a tool and then sharing the framework.
Cool.
So I'm going to pull open my screen on this. Boom. All right. So the tool, you're going to love this. You're going to smile a little bit. And I think it's a fantastic project. I really think they're doing some great stuff with HATS protocol. And I think it fits really, really well for, the stuff that you're passionate about and whatnot. We haven't done a lot of work with the HATS team, but I could see ourselves, like I'm keeping my eye on it. I just, really enjoy, I've met Nick more on the HATS team and hung out with him quite a bit and really enjoyed our conversations and whatnot. But I'd be curious to know from your side, like, what do you find like as the most useful element to hats? And, are you able to like, explain hats a little bit for everybody?
Yeah, I think if hats were to not work out, uh, it would be because they're too early, not because they're not right.
Right.
Hats is really, they really see the big picture and the philosophy of like decentralized autonomous organization. Most people are creating these DAOs thinking, oh, a DAO is a single authoritarian authority structure for, like, they say, I'm participating in this DAO. Like, really, what you want is for many autonomous entities without having that mandate control from above to be able to participate autonomously and permissionlessly to create an outcome. And that's the thing that we imagine in the future will be able to like massively pool capital towards huge world problems and solve them very quickly through this. We've had decentralized autonomous organizing a long time. It's called like business or nation level politics, and
Yeah.
like uh so it's really like, okay, well, how do you take those and coordinate them through these uh on-chain commitments and verifications that can be trusted by both sides? Usually in nation to nation politics or in business, you really can't trust them. You're taking certain levels of risk that can be eliminated with on-chain commitment and verification, right?
Hmm.
So
Totally.
we're basically saying, okay, how do we do that at this level? And so in that, you need composability. So like with business internationally, you have certain standards and things that make things composable, like, ways that you get payments around. Now you have stable coins, and back in the day you use like Swift or whatever. And, there were ways to make the international payments in business. And so that's one of the many things that you need to be composable between those two entities is a way to send and receive a payment, right?
Yeah.
Um, but another thing that you need to be able to do, that you need to be able to make a commitment to and or verify or validate, is a role or membership, right? Like, I'm dealing with this entity. This person says they're part of that entity. Do they actually belong to that entity, and do they have the authority to make a decision or proclaim a commitment to something that they're attempting to do, right? Like, so I want to be able to see that. And so like hats allows for the structuring of roles, what their authorities are in a on-chain and composable way for any like EVM. It
Totally. It's
also
just like,
conceptually as a protocol does it in a way that would work beyond the EVM, right? Like the first client implementation is a EVM implementation, but it could work on Near, it could work on Solana, anything.
yeah, let's just like, summary, like the element of, Ethereum and the smart contracts made this programmable money. I feel like a lot of what Hats is introducing is this programmable on-chain role, and I think
Uh,
it's a really, to your point, I think it's going to have more and more effect, I think, as more things move on chain. And I think the ethos of a lot of these AI verification and whatnot, as a result, could involve, moving more things on chain and moving more of that transparency there. So agents, it'd be interesting to know, like, is there a structure in the future with agents wearing hats, certain agents knowing that they've gotten access to a certain amount of funds, knowing that, they can make decisions and spend up to $200 or something, right? And then they can go loose with that and, participate in part of the organization. I think the case study that Hats has with Raid Guild is really cool. There's like a whole article and I think a YouTube video actually where they talk about it. It's an older one as well, but it is pretty futuristic. I think it's really neat what they're doing. I thought it was a good fit for our conversation.
it absolutely is. I think Hats is going to be a widely used protocol.
Yeah. And honestly, so you touched on a few of the things on the framework side. So funny enough, this is the framework, which comes from a paper that was written in 1986. Actually, I also have the paper here. I can link to this as well. By the theory of
Mhm.
Macmillan and Chavis in 1986 around the psychological sense of community. And there's four main elements or pillars to it. And I think it's just great looking at, a futuristic tool and looking at a really old research paper here. Um, and the four main components, you already even mentioned one of these, right? Like membership, and then the next one is influence, then integration and fulfillment of needs, and then shared emotional connection. And these are big buckets and categories of things that, cascade out. So membership, clear boundaries and belonging, people knowing who's in, feel safe and identity within the group. There's 4 or 5 even sub attributes I think they mentioned among that. Like whether that's boundaries, emotional safety, identification, personal investment, and then, your common symbols or rituals, right? And I think if you
Yeah.
see that, when you think about symbols, you think about personal investment, skin in the game, and around a component of membership. This is written in 1986. This wasn't even thinking about Web3 or, tokenized projects when it was, written. But so much of it feels this like ethos. And when I hear it, and I'm just like, maybe that deep into the Web3 world, I just can't I can see it. You know what I mean? On that side.
Yeah.
Um,
I think there's a interesting thing here in that, like, when we talk about like community and like describe like where a community is going, so like this integration needs and the emotional connection we often overlook, and it's because we think that we can dictate what it is. So like, for example, on the Near Forum, we posted this governance transition program, which says here's these 4 stages, right? Now,
mhm.
some people might read something like this and interpret it as this is a checklist for like how we move from one stage to the next, right? Some people might see that as this is a directional guideline of how we're going to make this journey, right? But they don't see it as a checklist, right? And so forth. And because of different people's perspectives and interpretation, desires, agreement, fulfillment, not what makes a community isn't that you've said this is where we're going, even if that gets voted or ratified, is that it continues to be said and spread so that you're all saying a shared narrative. Like you can learn a lot of things in building community from thinking about like church. If you grew up like I grew
Mhm.
up Catholic, and like there's so many rituals, it's like, do we have a place that we get together? Do we have shared stories and understanding? Like, do we understand our origins together? Do we understand why we're doing this? Do we understand like what our contributions are supposed to be? Like, so
100%. No, like
yeah.
totally. I agree 100. Like, and then, on the influence side of things, for general community, like how power can kind of flow both ways. And that's why it's really important early on, like setting a good culture initially, because that then shapes, the members that join, and then overall shapes the group back and forth. I think like status and component of these things, play out an important element for influence. Um, and then jumping into like integration and fulfillment of needs, I think there is a component where like value exchange, a value creation, this value exchange aspect is important, like real, um, you know, role, skill, fit for them, recognition and rewards in whatever way that might be. And that just increases like the stickiness side of things for them, right? To keep coming back. And then, yeah, around the shared emotional connection, I like the example there that you gave with like, with church and like the components of it. There's a lot of elements there that, I think even, people say like, building cult communities, building cult like
Mhm.
communities. There's, a lot to that around retention, around components of what makes a cult. And how do you think about taking mechanisms or certain components of what a cult had to actually like, layer into a useful, building, growing community.
Right. I mean, until the community is saying the things that you've canonized and put out there as the community, then
Hmm.
they're just one person's perspective that people have lightly agreed to, but they don't really like they aren't living them and have stake in them until they show signs of commitment, right? So like you could commit capital, but like another way is to show stake is that you show up every Sunday, is that you sing loudly. It's like that you host like a Bible study, or like whatever. There's so many different ways people can see that you're part of the community. And that's why I mean, like, stake isn't just how much do you put into the contribution jar, right?
Totally. Yeah. You mentioned earlier you said there's 8 different elements of, what was that? 8 different elements of contributions, or 8 different elements of stake?
Forms of capital. It's
Forms of
it's a theory that's out there, but if you like Google 8 forms of capital, it'll pop right up. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I love that. It makes a ton of sense, and it's an important part about these projects, and ties into one of these like sense of community psychologically, right? That people are putting into it.
I think one mistake people make is like they see this 8 forms of community and they start thinking, well, how do we measure and like value this exactly, right?
Yeah.
And so there's these like rules-based things of like measurement where like, okay, we're going to create a threshold and then pass this, not past that. Those end up getting gamed a lot. But then there's also like mechanism ways where it's like, here's how we'll choose, a random set of any three people to say how they feel about this. And then that'll create a score that then, if every month we score how we feel about this, we'll see, is it an aggregate moving up or down? It's like if you have a wearable that takes your like blood pressure or something, they always say it's not accurate. Like you can't count on it. What is good though? If your blood pressure is going up over like 3 months or down, your average reading is going to go up or down. So no one reading is good, but you can take directional like reading quite seriously. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that makes a ton of sense. Well, I guess like starting to kind of wrap up here, I'd be really curious, like one kind of bigger final question in a certain sense, advice from what you've seen. You've seen a lot of projects get funded. You've seen a lot of products. You've participated a lot in governance and being a deep part of multiple different communities. What would be some advice that you would give to founders in the early stages of starting their community? Anything around kind of community growth that you've seen, or what's some of the elements that you think would be most valuable for founders to think about in growing community?
Well, I always think of it in combined to the decentralized like DAOs. But when we think about just community in general, I think the first most important thing is defining what we are, right? Like, what is our purpose? So a lot of people call this like a mission, vision, values, but defining this and then creating like some type of membrane. What is the filtering mechanism to say who is in, who's out as part of the community? This doesn't mean they're part of the decision-making group.
Right.
That might stay one person for a while, right? Before you're able to like exit the community, right? But building your community first is, figuring out what are we and what are we doing here? And like, how do we like define this and then allow people to participate over time, right? So, think about like, what is that purpose, the membrane, and then think, okay, how can I make this more legitimate? So you could just say, we're going and getting burgers every day for the lunch break, right? And 10 people are like, oh, well, I kind of wanted like Thai or hot dogs or pizza or whatever. Or you could come up with a system that says, we're all going to write our top 2 ideas, and then we're going to count which one's got the most answers. Don't look at each other's things. And whichever one got the most, unless we got that yesterday, that's what we're going out to eat together. Now, versus one mechanism is that the boss just decides all the time. And the other mechanism is everybody has voice. Remember? In these communities, in community, like stake or participation is fully autonomous from the other person. You can't force that, right? So you have to make something so good that they want to participate. So in situation one where boss decides, people are going to exit. That's their other political right, right? And by increasing voice, you're going to lower the rate at which they exit, right? Somebody might be like, no, I want what I want every single day. Maybe.
Yeah. Totally.
Exits, right? But think, how do you create? That's what legitimacy is. Things that keep you, unified, over time and disagreement. That's the system is the scapegoat, not the other person.
I like that. And I think there's a huge thing to be said around co-creation, leaning into that ethos of retention and being more sticky, because you realize you're a part of that. You made the decision, you were part of a reason why we went to got Indian food, because that's like was a part of your history or part of what you voted or part of your voice, right? That makes you stick around with the group much longer than if your bosses continue just telling you, do X, do Y, do, Z, whatever, right? And I think the more projects can lean into that element of, letting their community participate more and letting them co-create more, it does, help a lot with overall engagement, retention. And I think like we've been playing a lot with community experience design, with different like bots and different things that we've built where people can participate in these different types of campaigns. And then as a result of that, we really see who rises to the top on some of them, like who really like were very passionate or had a really good result around that. And that then gives us an idea on like, okay, well, they were kind of the cream of the crop in a certain sense. Let's give them further opportunity. Let's pull them into an ambassador program now. Let's bring them closer to the team.
Yeah.
Let's bring them closer to decisions, right? And it's like this, like
a lot of this,
component.
So many of these things, it's like, especially the Dow grants, it's like, here's your money, don't mess it up, right? And it's not, here's like how you can grow with us and how we're going to grow and you'll grow alongside us, I feel that 100%.
No, this is great. Well, awesome. Is there any final like closing words or thoughts or comments you want to leave everybody with?
No, I think we got a lot of important stuff. You're already sparking me on our next conversation where we can talk about, you want to double down on the people who are doing great. What are mechanisms to do that? And to cut off the ones who are just, leeching on the system, right? And by doing that, that's how you actually create emergent, like evolutionary mechanisms. Right. And that's where you get a competitive edge. Like I think DAOs and communities of all types, they're going to take some amount of resources. Can they, expand the benefit to each participant as you add new participants rather than, lose it, That's why they can't have revenue as the top line, but it has to be, considered for sustainability,
Yeah, no, actually, I'll tell you what, we'll finish off this recording here. We'll hop backstage. I'll show you a couple cool things that we've been cooking, and everyone else in the real world will have to wait a little bit longer, but we've got some interesting things we've been working on lately. So I'd be stoked to show you and get your feedback on them. But thanks everyone else for tuning in. It was great for you guys to listen into this, and we'll catch you on the next episode of Community with Co-Unity. Definitely follow Joe. Got his Twitter below as well. You can find him on X. He'll be tagging us and myself as well. We'll catch you all on the next one. Thanks so much for your time here, Joe.
Thanks, Jeff.
This. All right.